Alright, so in the previous videos we've set up quite a number of lights here. We have a couple of lights, a volume light and a portal light set up for the ceiling window. We also have the same setup, a volume light and a portal light set up for this main window here, the arc window. And we have ourselves two portal lights set up over here in this hallway, which creates a pretty good amount of lighting. Only direct lighting, we haven't even activated Final Gathering yet. But before I go on any further with rendering, I have a bit of a problem. The problem is color management. Color management is extremely important when creating renders in CG because it can dramatically alter the results in a good way or a bad way depending on how you use it. If you don't know what you're doing, it's going to alter the results in a bad way. If you know what you're doing, you're going to be able to alter the results in the correct way, which is the best way. So what is color management? Well, it's a very complicated topic and a very dense subject. I could sit here and talk about it for hours, but I'm not going to do that for obvious reasons. Instead, what I'll tell you is that in Exercise 7, we have new color management tools that can allow us to tell XSI and Mental Ray which is the correct color space to use for our images. What do I mean by images? Well, any images that you bring into your exercise scene. Say, for example, the textures that are on these walls, the texture that's on this water tank, the textures that are on this door. All of these images are being brought in from an outside source. They weren't created in XSI. They were actually created in an image editing program. Because of that, XSI needs to know what color space they were created in so that Mental Ray can interpret them correctly and do any processing to them if it's necessary to make sure that they render out the right way. So if that sounds really weird and you really don't know what I'm talking about, let me just try to explain it in a very simple way. Basically, there's two main color profiles that we can use in XSI. In reality, there's actually three. But the third one is a custom one that you define yourself with your own gamma curve. But the first two are the two main switches basically. The first mode is linear. Linear color space basically is reserved for floating point images, images with a high bit depth. Images like OpenEXR and HDR images are considered to be linear by XSI. Images that are very low depth, like 8-bit images, JPEGs, things like that, even 8-bit Targas or whatnot, those are considered to be standard RGB or sRGB color space images. So by default, XSI really doesn't know what you're trying to do, so it's pretty much going to take a guess. So where are the parameters and settings that control which color space you use, whether if you use sRGB or linear color space? Well, the settings are actually in your preferences. So if we go up to File and we open up the preferences here, and then we go down here to Rendering and switch over to the Images tab. Let me just expand this a little bit so we can see the whole menu. We get a whole bunch of different options here. And down here we get this section of options, two main options called Color Profile. We can switch to Color Profile and the Gamma. What this does is switches the color profile for any newly created images. So right now mine's, for example, is set to automatic mode and the gamma is set to 2.2. If I go ahead and open up this drop down box, you can see that I have a few different options. I have automatic mode. In automatic mode, XSI will attempt to take a really good guess as to how your images should be interpreted. Should they be interpreted in linear color space or sRGB color space? That's what automatic mode will do. For the most part, automatic mode works out pretty good. However, if you don't like computers and software taking control of what happens with your work, you might want to come in here and manually switch to one of these two color profiles. For example, linear or sRGB. I like to keep it at sRGB simply because most of the images and textures I work with are JPEGs anyway. So about 95% of the time I'm working in sRGB color space, which works out great for me. In the rare case that I do bring in an HDR or an OpenEXR, say for background or for HDR rendering, I can manually switch that specific image to linear color space so it's interpreted correctly by Mental Ray. But I wouldn't do it from here. This option doesn't switch the current images. The current textures in my scene, if I switch this from automatic to linear, or if I switch to sRGB, will make absolutely no difference in my scene. Why is that? That's because the preference option here only controls images that are brought in from now on. So for example, if I switch this to linear color space, any images that I bring into XSI from this point on, any new images, will be converted to linear color space. Any old images that were already in my scene will be left alone and will not convert at all. They'll stay in whatever color space was used when I brought them in. So automatic mode is not exactly the best mode that I like to use. My preference is to stick with sRGB because I mostly work with a lot of JPEGs and Targas, things like that. Then you can also switch to the third mode, which is user gamma. This allows you to set a custom gamma curve. For example, you can switch from 2.2 to 1.8 to 1 to whatever you want. Whatever you like or whatever looks good, whatever you want to do, you can switch it. So user gamma is basically the manual mode where you can tweak the gamma curve to whatever you want. In my case, like I said, I like to keep it at sRGB. My mode was set to automatic, but I'm just going to go ahead and leave it like that for now. This really isn't important right now. This is only important for future projects. It really isn't going to affect the current project because everything's already textured and all the images are in. So let me close this preference page. And the reason I showed you that preference option was so that you can set it on your XSI on your machine and from now on work in the correct color space. So what happens if we didn't know about the preference and we brought in all of our textures and images like we did in this case, like they've been set up for this project scene here, but they're in the wrong color space? What do? Does that mean that we have to go to each and every single texture and change the color space manually? Essentially, yes. However, don't worry about it. It's not such a big deal. It's actually pretty easy to do. And I'll show you how easy it is to do that. But first, let me show you what I'm talking about here in terms of the manual options for this. And it'll make sense in a moment. What I'll do is I'll select something like, say, the water tank object down here. And I'm going to hit 7 to open up the render tree for that object. Okay, here's the render tree. And here's our images. And our images are these yellow, orange image clips right here. If we go ahead and double click on, say, the water tank's color JPEG here, the actual color map, and we open that up by double clicking on it, we get this big old PPG that pops up with lots and lots of options and properties. The one that we're interested in, however, is this tab right here next to General called Adjust. And if we go here in Exercise 7, you'll find these new color profile controls down here. And basically, what this does, it gives you access to the same exact options that we had in the preferences window we had a look at about a minute ago. Now, if you remember, I did mention that the preferences options changes the color profile interpretation for the entire scene for any images that come in later, any new images. So if you have old images in your scene already that you accidentally didn't set up the right color profile for, you're going to have to come in here and manually change each image clip. So in other words, you'd have to come in here and select each image clip, open up its PPG, and switch its color profile. So you're probably thinking, whoa, what if I have 100 textures? Does that mean I have to do this 100 times? No, you only have to do it once, and I'll show you a little trick to doing that once. Right now I'm just trying to go over these options so you understand them. So for this specific texture that I have here, the color map for the water tank color JPEG, you can see the color profile was set to linear. That's incorrect. Why? Because linear mode is for any type of HDR or OpenEXR images, basically any floating point images with a lot of bit depth. If I come in here, sRGB is more for this kind of image. Since this is a JPEG and it's only 8 bits, that means that the sRGB is the correct color space for this specific image. So I want to pick sRGB. If I wanted to, I can go to user gamma, and now I can change the actual gamma here, the texture. But that's not exactly what I want to do. I want to switch it to sRGB. Okay, so I'm going to leave it on linear, which was what it was set to before. So you can see that my images, they're all JPEGs by the way, are using the wrong color space. So that affects my render and makes my render look pretty bad. Let me go back here. I'm going to switch to one of these little camera views here, and I'm going to create a render preview. And there's my render preview. This is a preview render using the incorrect color space. This is a preview render using linear color space on images that are not supposed to have linear color space. They're supposed to be using a profile of sRGB. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit this little lock button and lock it down, just move it over. And I'm going to show you a little trick to switch all of my textures in my scene in one shot to sRGB color space very quickly. And then we're going to do another preview render and we're going to compare the two renders so you can see the difference between rendering in the correct color space and rendering in the incorrect color space. Okay, so let me close the render tree. I don't need it anymore. So what's that little trick for changing the color space for all of the textures in the scene? Well, if we hit 8 to open up an Explorer view, we come up here to where it says Scene Root. We can click on this button to change the scope of our Explorer. We want to go down here to where it says Images. So here we are in Images. We'll see two folders. Let me just expand this Explorer up a little bit. The first folder on the top is the Image Sources folder, and then on the bottom we have an Image Clips folder. Those are the only two that you'll find here. Okay. What we want to adjust is the image clips, not the image sources. So let's collapse the image sources by just clicking on the little minus icon there. And these are the images that we want to go ahead and adjust. So it's very simple. Select the first image, hold down shift and select the last image. That way we can select all of them in the list. These are all of the texture clips that we have in our scene. There's quite a large amount of textures here. We have, according to our MCP, 22. So that's a lot. Imagine if you'd have to go through 22 one by one. That would really stink. So I'm going to hit enter to open up the PPG, and this is a shared PPG. If I change the color profile here to sRGB, it'll change it for all of the image clips that I have selected. So you see, I could take 22 image clips at one time, I could take 50, I could take 100 if I wanted to, and change the option all in one shot. So now that I did that, let me close that. And since this render preview is locked down, I can just go ahead and create a new render preview. Move it on over here to the side, and we'll get to see a side-by-side comparison of using both color spaces. Okay, so let me lock this one down as well so it doesn't accidentally change or anything. So here's the two renders side by side. You can see that there is clearly a huge difference between the two. You can see at the left render, which is the wrong render, that's using linear color space on images that are supposed to be using sRGB color space. You can see right here that it's brighter and the textures are a bit more washed out compared to the image on the right. The render on the right is using the correct color space. It's using sRGB color space, and you can see that the images, you can see the color and the detail of the images comes out a lot more. The images on the left are a little bit washed out and don't look as good. The image on the right, you can see that the textures are, again, more colorful. The color contrast comes out much better. The color is being interpreted correctly. You can see that especially up here on the borders there of the ceiling window. So you can sit here and watch this for a little while on your free time and start to notice a lot of the differences in the two color spaces. So basically, all this time we've been setting up our lighting to cater to this, which is incorrect. This is the correct color space. So it's very important to understand color space in XSI and Mental Ray, because if you're using the wrong color space, you can spend your entire workday catering your lighting to something like this just to figure out later, wait a minute, it's the wrong color space, this looks totally wrong. Now you switch over to the correct color space, like in this image on the right, and now I have to adjust and fix my lighting to fit with this image on the right a lot better. So there you go. So I kind of messed up on the color profile stuff on purpose from the beginning. I didn't want you really to know about it, so that you can find out about it now and you can go, oh, okay, so that makes a lot of sense. Pretty cool. Alright, so now that you understand some of the aspects of color management in XSI, we can start to render this out correctly. So let me close those renders out. So now everything's going to render out a little bit differently. The colors are going to look a little bit different. Everything's just going to start rendering the way it's supposed to. Alright, so we've gone on for a pretty good while. I'm going to end this video here, and in the next video we're going to keep working on this scene, and we're going to get started on introducing some tone mapping. I'm going to introduce you to tone mapping, and we're going to start to bring in some final gathering into the scene and start getting ready to do a final render.